Have you personally ever encountered anything that you would say was supernatural?
I don't know. I just lived in England, and we lived in this house with, I think there were 9 of us, and I've never been one for, like, the concrete supernatural. I'll say that I believe in those gray zones. I totally do. I believe in those places where we can't explain something. I believe in the situations where we can't explain something. But living in this Liverpool house, I came into the house, and the residents that already were there told me that there was an old man ghost living in the house. And I was like, yeah, you know, whatever. Like, and they're like, no, you know, 2 of us had seen him in the mirror at night because we had these separate bathrooms. There were 3 bathrooms in the house, and in this one downstairs bathroom, they're like, we saw him, we tried to take a picture, and I was like, yeah, okay, you guys are still, yeah, I mean, you're messing with me. Like, it's cool. You can mess with the new housemate. I don't mind. You can I'm from America. I know. I'm gullible. And so I didn't really put much stock in it, and I had one housemate still that would not go into that corner of the house unattended. Like, and it's where the laundry room was, too, so, like, she would have to have an escort just to go do laundry in there at night because she was like, there is an old man there, and he walks the same path every night. And here's my problem. Like, I can't even go see scary movies, though, in truth, because I have a really, really vivid imagination. But I'm trying not to let them see that it's getting to me. I'm like, oh, they stop playing around, and yet I start not going into that little area at night because I'm thinking, you know, what if? And then I was home alone one day, and I walked through the laundry area to get to that back bathroom. And I came back out, and the dryer sits so that it's just to the side of the door, but it doesn't block it at all. So I came back out, and I went back through the same area a minute and a half later, and the dryer was sitting in front of the door, like it had been moved into the doorway all the way. So it was moved over like 2 feet, and I was totally alone in the house. And it was one of those moments where, as I say, I don't believe generally in concrete supernatural things, but I called like 3 of the housemates and made them come home because I was like, the dryer wasn't on, it wasn't kind of like vibrating over slowly. Like I had just walked through that room and the dryer had been sitting 2 feet away, and then all of a sudden it was in the doorway. So that's probably the closest that I've ever come. But aside from the time when it was like 2 a.m. in my house and I turned my light on too fast and I thought I saw a shadow of a body fall from the ceiling.
Oh.
And I got online, of course, being me, and I was on Twitter, and I was like, guys, there's a shadow fell from the ceiling. I can't sleep anymore. And like half a dozen people on my Twitter stream sent me links to something called Shadow People, which was basically all about people, like ghosts that are shadow formed and stuff. And I was like, great, thanks. I'm never going to sleep again in my own house. But so those are probably the only 2 things. I try not to think about them too much because I really like, I'm pretty easily spooked when it comes to stuff like that.
Now, one thing that we were saying is that we appreciated that you didn't just automatically, for your first book, jump on the vampire bandwagon because obviously with Twilight, which I do like the books, but you know, I do think that so many people have jumped on that bandwagon that, you know, it's kind of like, okay, let's do something more unique, you know. And
yeah, definitely.
So, and what I thought it was interesting, like that I saw that for the fall, like it seems perfect timing that your book is, you know, about witches because, you know, like in the fall they're going to be doing the Secret Circle on the CW, and so that's going to kind of be catching, you know, fire. So it's actually perfectly timed for your book to, you know, for longevity. And so what kind of made you decide to go that route for this first one?
I mean, and that's all these things are total zeitgeist. Like, witches have been really big this year, and fairy tales have been really big this year. There are 2 fall shows that revolve around fairy tales, and it's one of those things, again, it's so unintentional, and the publication process is so long. Near Witch sold back in the summer of 2009, you know, when Twilight was the big thing, and we hadn't even like moved into dystopian, which is the really big thing right now. And so it's so impossible to predict trends. And if I ask my agent, if I ask my editor, if I ask anybody, like the thing that any rational person will tell you is don't ever look at them and just kind of write the story that you want to write. I made a personal rule for myself. We'll see how long this lasts, but for all of the projects that I have written or that I have in the pipeline, my only rule is that I have to make an original world system. So like if I'm going to write witches, I can't capitalize on any existing mythology, like an existing world, for instance, the Elves Myth books or anything like that. And if I want to do ghosts, which is kind of what I'm doing next, I have to have my own world system. And so keeping that rule, for me, keeps me out of trouble because it keeps me out of trend. So I know that I'm not going to write something like vampires because I can't really, it's very hard to twist that in an original way that hasn't been done before. And so doing it kind of forces me into my little gray zone, and I kind of have to sit there and hope that it's popular and hope that people like it, even if it's not the thing that's trending right now. But it kind of helps me just focus on writing my own stories rather than, as my agent would say, looking at everyone else's papers, you know? So it's just been a personal rule for me that I always have to make my own world.
Now, when you talk about the world, one thing that I noticed is that you never really clearly paint out what the time frame is for the story. You know, we've kind of thought maybe 1700s, 1800s kind of thing. Where did you kind of in your mind see this taking place?
Well, it's so intentional that the story is as ambiguous as possible. I just answered a question for someone. They basically want to know, like, why was it set on the moors? And the best answer I could give is, like, I love fairy tales. I am obviously quite smitten with them. But in some of my favorite fairy tales, setting is just this kind of sketch in the background. The fairy tales almost seem to happen in a blank space. And that's great in that it keeps them perfectly timeless. But it's not great in terms of you don't really have a setting. And so for Near Witch, I wanted to make sure that I made setting as big a part as possible. I wanted to make it its own character. But in doing that, it makes it increasingly difficult to make it timeless because the more you give to the setting, the more clues you're going to give, context clues for what time period it's set in. So we tried as much as possible to set it in somewhere past. Obviously, you don't have modern technology. You don't have anything like that. In my head, obviously, I needed to have a template to work from, and the template was 1800 Northern England because the Moors are traditionally Northern England. And but I've had people that think it's like literally the theories I have gotten from different people have been everything from 1600 America to post-apocalyptic, and I just think it's hysterical. But for me, I just wanted to keep it as timeless as possible while giving you something. I wanted to give you some place. I just wasn't going to tell you when or where it was. And I think we have one or two clues that get in there, but literally, like, even down to making sure there are no dating details in terms of how tea is made. I mean, we got so nitpicky in the editing of this book to try and keep it as timeless as possible.
Yeah, that was because we just kept saying, well, it could be in a time where it's just really rustic, you know, where it's even now where people just are not doing that, or it could be in the past. So it was fun that we kind of were left thinking.
I mean, and keeping Near so isolated definitely helps. In that, I mean, it could be a more modern place that simply is completely cut off from the existing world, you know, from the world as we know it. So, but definitely, like, the ambiguity is completely intentional. I cringe a little whenever anyone calls it historical fiction because I tried so hard to not make it historical. So, it's meant to be ambiguous.
Now, I know, you know, you were saying how you really kind of wanted to Lexi to kind of be a badass in a way. And so, you know, and obviously she was definitely filled with a lot of strength and determination, and I really enjoyed her, you know, struggling with all the things that she was dealing with emotionally and physically. But I think for me, like, I actually really enjoyed the Thorne sisters, just their wisdom and, you know, just how they kind of were thrown to the side by other people, but they had such value. And I was just curious as to, you know, which characters did you really have the most fun developing? Obviously all of them are, and it's hard to say, well, this is my favorite, but I mean, were there some in particular that as you were developing it just really became a big passion for you?
Oh, the Thorne sisters are definitely my favorites. Thorne sisters and Wren, it's really strange. But because Wren was initially supposed to be this minor character in the book, and it became clear as I was developing Lexi that Lexi's investment in the village needed to come primarily from her sister, and so then Wren got bigger, and it might also be because, and this doesn't probably get to in the interview, but the the Thorne sisters are so much fun for me to write, specifically Dreska, and it might, because she's so much sharper. She's very, very dry, and but the two of them together, I don't know. I've never had a sister. Like, I'm an only child, and sibling relations in this book are such a big deal, whether it's Lexi with Wren or Magda with Dreska, and I love the way that Magda and Dreska interact with each other, and their dialogue and the way that they exist in this world and who they are. I would say that they are the only two characters who came into the story fully formed. I knew that they kind of dropped onto the page and I knew exactly who they were. And yet every now and then I'm writing them, again, I'll sound like a crazy person, but you write them and they just kind of surprise you. They say something and you didn't know anything about, but yet they say it with such confidence that you're like, oh, so that's what that is. So there's so much fun to write. They're kind of picks little pieces from people in my life that I know, the wittiest parts, I think, and the sharpest parts. But I definitely think that the Thorne sisters are right at the top of my to-write list. So.
Now, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, how throughout this conversation, you've talked about how a lot of things have just kind of fallen into place where events were happening that are really going to help support your book. And I thought it was interesting that I was envisioning that you were probably writing this book in the midst of all the Anthony saga, with Kaylee going missing, and then your book's coming out right after the Casey Anthony trial is over.
I didn't even think about that.
And I just thought it was really interesting because there is the subject of missing children, and that's something that always tugs at people's hearts, and it can suck you in. And so I just was wondering if you thought that at all, like even just subconsciously, just seeing those in the headlines sometimes, like if that ever influenced you to kind of go that route. Again, I kind of just thought it was all kind of coincidental, but I thought it was interesting.
I say marvelously not in like a happy way, but it is marvelously coincidental the way things work in life. And it's certainly, to be honest, I was a second semester senior in university when I was writing this book. I don't think I turned the TV on once the whole semester. I would like literally lived in my art studio, and then I would leave from 9 to 11 p.m. each night to go to a coffee shop on the corner and write Near Witch, and then I would go right back to studio. So I can't say that it consciously influenced me. It's quite possible that it did subconsciously. The thing I will say is that the Near Witch evolved backwards in that I wrote the fairy tales within the book, like the games that the children play and the stories that are told at bedtime first. And from those fairy tales, I wrote the setting. I wrote Near, because I wrote the place that would create the fairy tales. And I wrote the residents of Near then, the people that would live in this place and tell those fairy tales. And it works backwards and backwards and backwards, so that the last things that I came up with were Lexi and her younger sister Nicole. And so this is one of those stories, and again, this is not the way that it worked with my next book, so it's not exactly like a process that I have and or would recommend. It's just the way that this particular story happened, in that the plot came after the world. I knew I wanted to tell a fairy tale, and so I wasn't even sure when I was first drafting that what I was going to do with the Near Witch. I knew that it was a story, and I knew that it then needed to impact the present, and I had all of these elements kind of on my plate, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with them. For a long time, I was not sure what the fate of those children would be, or if they would disappear, or what would happen. Kind of wrote out multiple scenarios. So I don't think that there was a conscious influence, but I mean, it is really fabulous from a psychological perspective when you go back and you look at all the things that were popular at the time that I was writing it. And I do think it's really fascinating to look at that, like what's in the media and what's popular in literature. And like you can kind of see the way that stories evolve in our heads when we're just kind of playing around. Mm-hmm. And that everything is circling around us. And I know that a lot of art that I was looking at the time, I was a communications design major, and I know that art had an impact on it. Someone did a review of Near Witch the other week, and they referenced this really obscure European music video called Glossally, and I totally watched this music video by Sigur Rós, and I totally watched it like 2 weeks before I started writing, and you can see the direct influence of that music video on that story, the entire setting, really. And so I hadn't even thought of it in 2 years until I read that review. And so I think it's amazing, like, all of the different factors in our lives that will influence our work if we're in a creative field, whether it's art or writing or what have you.